Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2.
Chapter 10.
Barriss felt the sun's warmth envelop her body. It saturated her skin, its warmth penetrating through her muscles to the bones underneath. She inhaled the sweet-smelling air deeply, expanding her diaphragm to its limits with each inhale and subsequent exhale. She closed her eyes and envisioned the vastness of her surroundings in intricate detail, how each element added to the vibrancy of life all around her, an uncomplicated yet fully orchestrated chaos of purpose and beauty. Barriss focused on the gurgle and rush of the small river a few meters distant in the copse of floor they had yet to depart from, how it provided specific measures of static comfort in the wake of the unknowable. A flock of birds flitted back and forth, drumming the air with their tiny wings. With another deep breath, she sighed contently. She was acutely aware of how long she had been seated in this position, patiently waiting for further contact from the voice she had heard earlier, a voice that, unknowingly at the time, she had fully expected to hear. Yet it was silent, but she felt no discouragement. Not one shred of frustration brewed within her, nor an inkling of agitation, not since bequeathing mercy upon the feline. What thought she could not render completely silent, despite her many attempts to do so, was her relation to time itself. She did not know the oddities of this planet's cycle, but she could not shake the feeling that she was experiencing the longest day of her life. Her mind associated the sounds around her with the sounds she'd experienced in the past, knowing that a single tone emitting from any source was an establishment in each timeline. A bird's warble would be answered by its mate in seconds. The rush of water around a single river stone is a constant, never-ending measurement of time. The rustle of leaves from the surrounding vegetation will last only as long as the air moved them, the wind adhering to its chaotic but still organized flow. Piecing together these elements, Barriss established an involuntary count of the exact seconds and minutes that passed, yet she knew the sun hadn't moved an inch above her since her encounter with the giant cat that was currently curled up beside her. Next, for time here did not exist at all. Feeling a fortified peace within her soul, Barriss was roused from her meditation by a rustle to her right. She blinked her eyes a few times to adjust to the bright light of midday, catching Quinn's form rising from the bed of crushed grasses it had made for himself, and then to Eerie, who was only a few meters away. She watched as he padded silently toward her, bent to lick her open palm as he passed, and proceeded into the trees. The only sound marked its destination was a slight pitch change when his mouth lapped at the flowing waters. She turned her gaze to Eerie, who was also waking, her mouth stretched wide in an unabashed yawn that exposed the entirety of her surprisingly massive jaws. Taking the cue, Barriss stretched her legs too, wiggling her feet, feeling the warm breeze between her toes. She pushed her arms high into the air and flexed her fingers, feeling the warm sun touch each individually before turning them to the ground beneath her and pushing herself onto her feet. Barriss turned her attention to the cat, the massive newcomer who, for reasons she couldn't fathom, had decided to stay. She studied the carnivore, noting the intricacies of its form. She supposed it was male, but questioned that conclusion as it defied her knowledge of basic biological instincts of predator animals. Why then had it decided as such? She watched as it slowly opened its own eyes, blinking as she had to readjust to the light. He opened his mouth to yawn in a fresh air, exposing the razor-sharp hooked teeth lining each segment of its massive jaws. Is he a representation of something I am to divine, she thought, an ode she knew, birthed directly from every teacher she had ever known and the lessons contained therein. Barriss tilted her head in contemplation as the feline pushed its forelegs as far as it could reach to shake the stiffness out of the tightly packed muscles beneath the snowy fur. Dagger-like claws raked at the ground before it retracted them and hefted itself from the ground. Standing 2 meters high, he turned his gaze to stare directly at her. Briefly, they locked eyes, before he too slowly padded away for a cool drink. She stared after the big cat, amazed and still curious about his desire to stay with them. I should be afraid, she thought, getting up to follow him, and wondered why she wasn't. She knew the answer, of course, was that she was more powerful, that she would have been true for most beings, sentient or not. This thought struck her as the accompanying emotions did not correlate. Why wasn't I afraid? Circling back to thoughts of her former teachers and masters, she could not deny the messages they had imparted, particularly those regarding fear. And Dolly advised negating any notion of attachment to a particular thing, thereby eliminating any fear born from losing it. Sidious advised embracing the passion derived from a specific thing to utilize the emotion to overpower any associated fear it may elicit. And Vader, who was perpetually angry, would advise to simply destroy the fear itself, eliminating its source outright. In retrospect, she realized none of them were wrong, but more to the point, she understood at the moment that she had been practicing all three recitations simultaneously for years. She decided to understand fully what this cat represented, she needed to know. Just then a memory jumped out of her consciousness, and she slapped her forehead. Of course. It was a mission from her incredibly early days as Master Unduli's Padawan. They had traveled where? She spoke this aloud, as she couldn't remember. She couldn't even remember the reason for leaving the temple, but she did remember the attack. The Corellian dire cat had sprang from some undergrowth and bitten the back of her neck hard before her master could react. She remembered the blood and had distinctly remembered the pain. When the attack occurred, she remembered her master losing her concentration and crying out in alarm right before Barriss felt her soothing, warm hands surround the pain, gently numbing the suffering she was enduring. Undali had expressed such a deeply rooted sympathy for her that it had reduced her to tears. Barriss's mouth fell open, shocked to figure out only now that her former master had defied her own teachings and created a bond with her derived from emotion. Instinctively, Barriss reached toward the back of her neck to feel for the scars she hadn't thought about in decades, but as her fingertips patted the base of her skull to her shoulders, she felt nothing but the smoothness of her unflawed flesh beneath her fingertips. And Dolly told her that the scars would remain with her throughout her rest of her days, and Barriss herself remembered running her fingers over the roughened blemishes. In disbelief, she brought both hands up in a concentrated effort to locate the scars she knew was there. What? Was all she found herself saying, and try as she might, she could not locate them. The scars were not there. With a flooding rush of emotion, she was all at once horrified and outraged, incredulous, stupefied, and then afraid. Something unique to her was no longer there, and she knew Bacta was not to blame. Memories aside, it was the single physical bridge she always knew she possessed from her earliest consciousness. This could not be. Determined to find them, Barriss began to scratch at her flesh, raking her fingernails down her neck again and again, harder and harder, hell-bent on locating the feature that she knew was there. Ignoring the pain, she clawed at her skin, feeling it give under her fingernails, feeling the warm wetness run down her back. No. Alarm gave way to panic, and she continued to peel small sections of flesh away, feeling the dampness spread to the small of her back. She was unaware of Erie's sudden presence at her side until she felt the hard, quick lashing of her tail across her chest. Barriss was knocked backward off her feet, landing with a thud in the grasses on her backside. The blow, although not painful, was strong enough to deprive her lungs of air, and gasping to regain control, she snapped out of her feverish self-mutilation to stare up into the cloudless sky. Her heart was beating rapidly, and she felt out of control. The darkness was approaching. She stared at a single bird rotating in a tight circle directly overhead and tried to calm her heart, but soon her vision dimmed, her peripherals overcome by the darkness that was consuming her entirely. A ruckus and unnervingly obnoxious sound echoed through Barriss's head, sounds within sounds feeding upon themselves, chord belted out with a head-splitting pitch, ripping her mind out of its protective stupor. She dared to open her eyes, prepare for the harsh reality of sunlight, but found she was surrounded by utter blackness. She pushed herself up into a seated position, a searing pain tearing at her back. She instinctively reached a hand around and felt the source of the discomfort, a tunic that was plastered against her neck. Peeling it back slowly, she felt every centimeter of the dried blood protesting the action from waist to shoulders, and avoided screaming out in pain that shot through her from head to toe. Despite the absolute darkness surrounding her, Barriss thought she saw a form within it as she regained focus. The form had a human quality to it that drew her attention entirely. She attempted to stand but was tightly surrounded by two thumpers at her sides and the cat in front of her, forming a protective boundary. As her eyes continued to adapt to the darkness, definition began taking shape, presenting the form as a cloaked being Barriss didn't need to see anymore. "Master," she said from her seated position, watching as Luminara Undali reached up to remove the shroud from her head. "Why do you insist on dragging me back to this realm, Padawan?" The words were hollow, whispered, and dripping with contempt. Barriss froze in both physical action and complete thought. She was completely unaware that she had called upon her former master. "Your conflict, Padawan, your conflict betrays you," Undali whispered again, silencing all other sounds around her. The constant chirps of the night-born insects and occasional cries in the distance of some nocturnal skirmish were swallowed to completion by the forceful whisper. "What conflict, Master? I have chosen my path. There is no conflict," Barriss replied unevenly, realizing how non-committal the phrase sounded even to her. "You have, in fact, chosen nothing, Padawan, for you do not even know who you are," Undali responded, taking the brief conversation down a path Barriss could never have suspected. "Until you come to terms with your reality, you will cling to what you think you are." The words sounded almost melodious, Barriss recessing within her minds to points in the distant past. She began to weep silently, feeling as though she were a child caught in a lie. "Look around you, Padawan," Undali continued, appearing to move closer to a point just beyond the feline's body. "At your feet lies fear, a fact you failed to realize when you first encountered him. What is the meaning in that, I ask you?" Barriss swirled a question within her mind, unsure if she should entertain the question with an answer or ponder the sanity of answering the question at all. She decided on another route entirely. "I do not mock you, Master." The figure of Undali sat, crossing her legs underneath her, folding her hands in contemplation as she locked her gaze on Barriss. "But you do, Padawan. You mock me through the contempt with which you carry yourself." Barriss considered the comment for a long moment, trying to figure out how to digest the words without further context. "You do not possess that which completes you, yet here you are determined to proceed blindly." Undali tried with another avenue. "You've confronted and defeated fear and ultimately allied with it, Padawan." She continued, motioning toward the gap between the two. "You've embraced courage, putting forth a trust in something other than yourself." She proceeded with a sidelong glance toward Quinn. "And you've imprinted yourself onto compassion itself." She finished with a motion in the hand toward Eerie. Barriss felt an awakening at hand. Her skin began to quiver as quakes of realization shot through her, shocking her system even further than it had been since arriving. The form of Master Unduli dropped its head, her gaze immediately more menacing with the act. "These are not traits attributed to either Jedi or Sith, Padawan. On their own, perhaps," she began, then paused to emphasize her point, "but not in concert." Her tone turned dour with a deep reticence. "I ask you again, Padawan, who are you?" "I am me," she thought, feeling the truth of the words spark a central nerve from deep within her. In stark contrast to Master Unduli's description of her traits, she felt anything but courageous about giving the thought verbal credence. Barriss felt helpless to answer without betraying her own misgivings, the sharp pains along her spine a testament to that fact. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing was forthcoming. "You know the truth, yet you remain unwilling to accept it," Unduli said while shaking her head from side to side. "Have you truly fallen so far, Padawan?" Barriss had heard enough. "Stop calling me that," she shouted, an agitation forming, building at the corners of her mouth. "I am no longer anyone's Padawan, Master." Unduli recentered her head, a thin smile creeping across her face. "Truly? Then why are you here?" Barriss thought the question through and was hesitant to respond immediately, alighting Unduli's gaze with a cold, penetrating stare of her own. "Because I choose it," she decided. "Diverting the truth will only lead to your downfall, Padawan." Burning anger welled from deep within Barriss upon hearing the term again. Her facial expression, she knew, betrayed the control she was trying in vain to project. "Careful, Padawan. Your emotions betray you. You have grown powerful in your years, but that power only reflects what you project. I am not here with you after all, am I?" Unduli responded. Barriss knew the truth of it. Her former master was long dead, on Stygian Prime. What was seated before her was something she created. Or was it? she thought with a sudden jolt. Oh, yes. We come closer to a conclusion, Unduli laughed. Something foreign to Barriss's ears. She couldn't remember ever hearing the Jedi Master laugh. You will be Padawan, because I have no other name for you, young one. Barriss was taken back. My name is... With that brief hesitation, she fully understood the truth and anticipation. The waves of shock realizing made perfect sense to her as her entire consciousness focused on a singular point. Tears welled in her eyes and suddenly felt weak beneath the galaxy's weight. Unduli's expression only brightened as the smile pulled higher upon her cheeks. Without uttering a word, she motioned with the turned hand toward Barriss, while slightly turning her head to the side, prompting Barriss to put words to her thoughts. Barriss could only stare blankly into Unduli's eyes, deflated and devoid of life. Child, there is no shame in discovery. Accept your fate, then divine your destiny. Once truth is yours, it cannot be taken from you. Unduli prompted her. Barriss wanted to shout until her breath left her. She felt the pangs of anger welling within her again, but did not possess the physical ability to contain the rage for a single purpose and let those embers die out. She wanted to pound her fist into the ground until her knuckles bled, knowing there would be nothing to gain from the options. She cupped her face into her hands, and she wept. I have no name, she mumbled into her palms, the skin wet from her tears. Thana, perhaps, Unduli prodded. Thana was never me. She was a construct I created to live through a lie I wanted to believe, Barriss said between sobs. You did not expect to be bequeathed the title of Darth, did you? Unduli asked her in all seriousness. Barriss raised her head from her hands slightly and trapped Unduli within her severe gaze. I am no Jedi, she replied with an icy tongue. Nor are you Sith, Unduli quickly added. Barriss also understood the truth in that statement, creating an emptiness she had been working diligently to avoid. She could only look down in genuine shame, not from the tender expression from her former master had adopted, but shame toward inward. She had lost her identity before she had ever lost a sense of herself. Unduli returned a light smile to her face. You have established who you are not, young one. Perhaps now is the time to establish who you are. She addressed Barriss in a soft voice. Barriss recognized the inflection of tone and let her memories flood her consciousness, letting a warm peace wash through her to completion. My name. My name. She bubbled at the words, finding it hard to keep her voice from portraying her emotional state. Barriss could only look up, and the tears welling through her vision, she did her best to focus on her master. I'm sorry, Master. I was not there for you when you needed me. Despite the many months since she had heard Ahsoka utter those same words, she thought of the Togruta coming to mind immediately. The weight of the apology in Vader's citadel meant nothing to her then. However, now she physically felt the sentiment it should have imparted. Time has a way of sorting things into perspective, my child, Unduli responded. With that perspective comes your purpose, and only you can define it. And you, she said, pointing a long finger at Barriss, have nothing to apologize for, not to me. Acutely aware that her former master had answered a thought, she smiled briefly and winked an eye. You see, Master, I do not mock you. Unduli chuckled lightly and nodded before closing her eyes and slowly retreating into the darkness. My name is Nara. Barriss mouthed the name she had been thinking through since learning her truth. She had yet to experience the feelings that shot through her from head to toe like jolts of electricity. She knew renewed in every wake. A warm purpose coursed through her entirely, a peace she had never felt embrace her. She had mentally created something new and ancient in shedding who she thought herself to be. She had broken through the walls she had created and embraced her truth with finality. Go in peace, Nara, Unduli whispered as her form dissipated completely into the inky blackness of their surroundings. Nara, Barriss repeated to herself, feeling the tug of her lips as she formed a smile she warmly expected. Nara, she said again and closed her eyes gently. Nara, Nara, Nara. Again and again she heard her name, a soft voice whispering in the wind. Nara opened her eyes to the encroaching darkness surrounding her. She pushed herself off the ground, and the sun, hovering just between two high rocky pinnacles in their Tarnals to the east, highlighted her eventual destination. The warm light bathed her in its glow, a visual representation of the swirling thoughts her mind suggested. She looked to either side and found all 3 companions lying where she had remembered them. She felt life emanating from every corner of the valley. She breathed in the sweet air with a massive inhale and heard the scurrying, fluttering, and buzzing of the Omdrian denizens all around her. Without hesitation, she opened herself to the forest, bridging all her senses, and felt its presence flood her like never before. She raised her arms above her head. "I am Nara!" she shouted as loud as she could, silencing all the rummaging about her in its initial wake. She was nearly taken off her feet with the resounding echo of her excitement found purchased within its chest. She tossed her head from side to side to see various birds and fist-sized insects scramble to alter their courses to flight. Foliage folded and fluttered, and the grasses bent to themselves from the wake of the echo. "I am Nara," she said hushedly as the last of her echoes died in her ears. "That you are." The whispered voice of Zaina finally appeared. Nara was overwhelmed with feelings she could not describe, bringing her to her knees and tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She felt whole, complete. Her perspective shifted entirely. She could only bask in the emotion as words had escaped her by their very definition. She could not find any she knew to describe what she was experiencing. "Don't be saddened, young one," Xana said with a telling compassion. Nara blurted something incoherent, then shook her head with a broad smile stretched through across her face. "I am anything but, mistress," she finally managed, folding her face into her hands only because it felt like the right thing to do. "Then let your emotions run free for a time. What we need to discuss can wait," Zana replied in a tone not unlike Master Unduli's. Nara smiled again at her cerebral comparison, noting how active her mind was and how her thoughts were coming to her. And with that, the veil was lifted, exposing her surroundings to what they were: burnt orange, dark red, yellow rock, pocketed with fine white dust, littered her vision in all directions. What was expansive grassy plains in the valley they had been traveling was in truth a wasteland of time-worn, cracked, and hardened mud, suggesting that they were once vast waters covering the area. Thickets of thorny shrubbery dotted the bleak landscape, and their leaves dull indigo, absorbing most of the fading sunlight, creating the impression that they were black as pitch. Nara took her time scanning in all directions, finally assured that what lay before her was what she had expected. The gentle melodies of what had once appeared as colorful songbirds were high-pitched screeches emanating from featherless avians beating leathery wings against the rancid air. "What is real is only what the mind perceives real to be," Zaina whispered again, the voice sourcing just over Nara's right shoulder. She turned slowly, not expecting to confront any proper form or being, but was presently surprised to face a stunning apparition. Long, curly blonde hair framing a porcelain face with lips half parted into a smile. Zaina's form stood as tall as she did, the ends of her hair caught in a breeze of sorts that was not of this world. Nara was entranced and humbled by the vision before her, feeling the power emanating from a being centuries removed from life. She focused briefly upon Zaina's eyes. Swirling shades of white filled the sockets, hinting at the power she knew went far beyond what she sensed, filling her with a perceived reverence she knew was anything but imaginary. "You have great potential, Nara. It is difficult to shred the veil so simply." Nara understood only then how minuscule her knowledge in the arts of sorcery indeed were, as an extension of the being that tasked her with the mission. Had he withheld so much as to cripple any chance of success she may have had, or was it something deeper? The man needed to be more capable of the more profound concepts or had affinity for them. She knew Palpatine was powerful beyond her even her comprehension, but she began questioning his limits within certain spheres of influence. "You are right to question your master," Zaina whispered. Nara had a sudden tug of unease course through her as she gazed at her surroundings again. "Without even a lesson, Zana, you have taught me more than he ever did." She paused in deep reflection. She felt an inward urge to laugh outright. The man had lied to her, in one form or another, for as long as she had known him. As this coming night had already been an awakening in the truest sense, the thought that the man's self-serving actions would be time better wasted on someone else felt exactly right. Without another second of hesitation, she gazed She returned her gaze into the spectral form of the long-dead Sith master, concentrating every impulse, nerve, and emotion. I serve no master, mistress. The apparition of Zaina was impossible to read. The white within her eyes sockets marbled in a hypnotic swirl as small traces of vapor flowed slowly from the corners. Nara was sure she saw a smile crease her lips. "Then you truly are Nara," was all her spectral voice said.